Can a single person change the world? Definitely yes is the consensus after the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev. Change it for the better, claims the West. The last Soviet leader boldly brought the USSR in from the cold, reforming, agreeing to independence for satellite states, all this without bloodshed. But for many Russians, he gave away an empire and ushered in the humiliating chaos of the 1990s. We'll ask about the legacy of a leader who outlived his time in power by 30 years before passing away Tuesday at 91. With Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, as EU leaders ponder visa restrictions for Russians, the Nobel Peace Laureate today embodies a bygone era and a promise, the promise of a world where walls come down, where East meets West. Their citizens do business, make friends. Was glasnost and the great thaw that ended the Cold War just a brief interlude, a freak exception? Or will there be other Gorbachevs to bring down the iron curtains of the present? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking what's left of Gorbachev's legacy. And joining us from Ivre, France, he was Mikhail Gorbachev's last spokesperson as president, journalist and historian Andrei Grechev. Thanks for being with us.
Hello.
Also joining us, a former French ambassador to Russia, Jean de Glignesti, today an academic. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Ukrainian academic Anastasia Shapochkina. I won't reveal your age, but born a Soviet citizen, shall
Indeed.
we say. President of the Eastern Circle's think tank, lecturer at Sciences Po. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. He certainly did change the course of history. Fraser Jackson looks back at the life and times of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev.
He was a man of change and became an iconic figure of the 20th century. Born in 1931 to a peasant farming family, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to the top of the Soviet Union and ultimately oversaw its collapse.
To put it briefly, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a sign of what was going on in the world and where it was heading to. This event gave rise to a great lot of changes.
Gorbachev came to power in 1985 at the age of 54 and represented a new era for the Communist Party. His goal, saving the Soviet system through reform, and the changes were not limited to internal affairs. Looking to warm Cold War relations with the US, Gorbachev launched a groundbreaking dialogue, eventually signing a bilateral treaty to reduce nuclear weapons. In 1988, he pulled Russian troops from Afghanistan. Gorbachev looked to jumpstart a stagnant economy through a combination of restructuring and government transparency, known as glasnost and perestroika. But the country's financial woes worsened. Liberals accused him of being too slow, conservatives of leading the country to its demise.
Of course, we made mistakes. We waited too long to reform the Communist Party, to reform the Soviet Union too. We did not anticipate the problems to come. When people started earning more and consuming more, the market was not at all supplied to meet the demand. Hence these huge queues in stores.
In August of 1991, Gorbachev survives a coup attempt, but the damage was done. Under pressure from the new Russian president Boris Yeltsin and other states, he resigned as president of the USSR. The Soviet Union had fallen.
When I saw that in Alma-Ata an agreement had been signed in order to create a new independent state, I went to television and declared that I stopped my duties as president. I could have stayed. I could have called the Congress of People's Deputies, the Supreme Soviet. I could have called the army. But I saw that the people would have been divided, even if people voted in March to keep the Soviet Union. But I didn't want the bloodshed.
His biggest regret, the fall of the Soviet Union. His domestic reputation never recovered from overseeing its collapse. But it would endear him to some former Soviet states and to the West. His role in bringing about the end of the Cold War also earned him a Nobel Peace Prize.
Andrei Grechev, we spoke in a year-end show last year marking the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union about this. Did you see this man rising to the occasion when he becomes the third leader in just a couple of years after the passing of Leonid Brezhnev as head of the Soviet Union? Did you see that this man would become such a historical figure?
Well, good question. To answer it, I would say that even him at that moment was not at all foreseeing for himself such, I would say, a captivating future. Because, well, it's natural that he, as well as a small circle of people around him, were conscious of the fact that the Soviet system, at the end of the 70-year age of Bolshevik experience, was actually a kind of at the end of its almost last breath. So it needed modernization, it needed fresh blood, it needed to a great extent being freed from the huge weight of the armaments race, especially because the only purpose of this race that was taking a great part of the Soviet national product was to prepare for a war that would be senseless because suicidal for any partner who would take part in it. So Gorbachev's initial vision of what would be his task in case he is elected was just to try to perfection the system, to free it from all the errors and criminal aspects of the past associated with the Soviet future.
Yeah, and this is somebody whose remit had been agriculture inside the Politburo, who I think had only once, if I'm not mistaken, been outside of the Soviet Union, and yet he has this vision.
Yeah, he had this vision, but he was not the only one. In a way, Gorbachev certainly is an exceptional person, and you wouldn't be astonished that I'm considering him to be such. At the same time, he was representative of, I would say, quite a generation of this second row, I don't know, backbench, if you can use this word, communist apparatchiks who were impatient to take the places of the dying, old age Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and others, who has a kind of put the whole country in the kind of the lethargy. And they were impatient to take their places, but they couldn't imagine what huge task they would have to face once they are in power.
They couldn't imagine it, and the whole world couldn't imagine that just a few short years later, the Berlin Wall would come down. The headline in local newspaper in Berlin this Wednesday, "Thank you for our freedom, Gorby." That's BZ newspaper. Berlin once also, let's just remind our viewers, the capital of Soviet-dominated East Germany.
Troika made it possible to attempt to establish democracy in Russia, and that democracy and freedom became possible in Europe, that Germany could be united, and the Iron Curtain disappeared.
Werden konnte und der eiserne Vorhang verschwunden ist.
Jean de Glignesti, your reaction listening to Olaf Scholz's tribute?
Well, it's true that the Germans owe a lot to Gorbachev. You know, everybody remembers when Honecker called Gorbachev and asked him support of the Red Army to contain the demonstrators and so on. And the answer of Gorbachev was, you are overtaken by history, and the leader should be supported by his people. And Gorbachev was a man of peace. He didn't want to shed blood, and I think he will remain in history as the man who sort of brought peace and put an end to the Cold War.
Yeah, we heard in that interview, that clip where he was speaking of France 24 a few years back, how he realized there was the potential for civil war.
In Russia?
Yeah.
In fact, there was a sort of civil war. Gorbachev tried to save USSR. He tried to modernize it, but to save it. And he made a referendum in March 1993, and he won this referendum. Basically, the question was, do you want to maintain USSR as a form of free republic union, but to maintain it, basically? And he won the referendum. But this was refused by the traditional part of the society, and this was the beginning of the coup against him, and this led, in fact, to his exit, resignation, and to the end of the USSR.
To the end of the USSR. Anastasia Shapochkina, what's your memory of that beginning of the end of the USSR?
I was a very small child when the last years of the USSR. My memories date to the portraits of Lenin in every childhood in the kindergarten classroom, and then which were in Ukraine replaced with the portraits of Ukrainian poet once the Soviet Union fell apart. So overnight to have a change of portrait, but in all of schools and kindergartens. But especially, of course, it was the memories that I have of 1990, 1991. I have very vivid memories, nevertheless, and those are memories of empty shelves in the shops, of very long lines for bread, for sausage, for anything actually you wanted to get, and there were for toilet paper. I have memories, literally, you won't believe it, of people going around with rolls of toilet paper hanging on ropes just all over themselves, because once you get your hands on something, pretty much anything in shops, you just get as much of it as you can put your hands on, because the deficit was really reigning. And also the memories of that period of my childhood also are covered with sound, if you want. So what the sound I heard most living in a Khrushchevka apartment on weekends would be the sound of funeral marches, because a lot of people would die actually of overdose, of heroin addiction. And Gorbachev also was the head of the Soviet Union during the last 3 years of the war in Afghanistan, which brought the heroin addiction epidemics into Russia and into the other former Soviet Republic states, which became independent states, and as Russia became one of the first destinations and then a big hub for the transit of the heroin toward Europe. And that also is a legacy of, including of his reign partly as well, and which we talk less about. So yes, definitely the memories are more on the hard side than on the...
A secret meeting takes place in a forest, and it becomes clear that Ukraine doesn't want to continue with the Soviet Union.
Ukraine and Belarus, yeah, and Ukraine being a really crucial part of this deal. And why it's so important is because it is the most numerous republic in terms of population, is the biggest republic. It is the strongest economy of the other 14 republics. And of course, historically, it is tied to Russia. As Vladimir Putin has mistaken recently, right, the appearance of the people with what's inside. Thus, also, maybe it wasn't expected that not only Ukraine wasn't going to want to continue with the Soviet Union, but later didn't want to become part of the CIS as well. And then we know now where we are as well. So just to, that of course was a crucial step which cemented already the downfall of the Soviet Union. But before that, I want to just challenge maybe a couple of statements which we just heard. First is that Gorbachev brought independence and freedom, which is truly the way that the West portrays Gorbachev. And the second is that it happened without bloodshed. And that he brought independence and freedom is often contested by people inside Russia, including leading intellectuals and civil society activists, and up until today, and journalists, because they just all bring testament to the same thing. Inside Russia and inside the capitals of the republics, there was such a wave and such a demand for independence and freedom and democracy that there was just the Gorbachev maybe didn't have, we could say, the nerve to crush it with military force, but he wasn't at the origin of that. The demand had already been generated by years of stagnation, maybe by the aspirations of the people or the change of generations, but the demand was there and the force was there. It was unleashed by his reforms of perestroika and glasnost, but it was the force which was from within. And the second statement, which it happened without bloodshed, that unleashing of that energy, that would be challenged by the people in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Georgia, in Uzbekistan. It would be challenged by the people in Azerbaijan, where the military intervention of Moscow actually cost blood to the citizens of those today independent states before they became independent, and as a response either to public demonstrations or to the demands of independence, of which Lithuania made the first move.
Those final days of the Soviet Union, Andrei Grechev, you're the spokesperson for Gorbachev. Did you feel that pressure that Anastasia is describing?
Well, that pressure, it was. It didn't come to the surface by itself. Actually, the origin of the whole phenomena of the eruption of this volcano of a national factor inside the Soviet Union was doubled. First, it was the fact that Gorbachev, in fact, and with his initial project, not only announced but actually brought the proof of his determination and seriousness that he was refusing to use the force, because to suppress this kind of manifestation and of nationalist, autonomist, or separatist movement. Because as, the people of older age like me, they certainly remember that actually the ways to keep together in a form of a unitary state of the Soviet Union was certainly the suppression, the violence, the KGB, the army, certainly without forgetting the role of the party and the propaganda. But once Gorbachev declared in his speech in December of 1988 before the General Assembly of the United Nations that the Soviet Union and its new leadership are suggesting to renounce the use of force in the international relations in general. And second, that according to his vision, what he was calling the new political thinking, each people has the right to choose the freedom of choice of its political system and the organization of its life. It's true that to a great extent in December of '88, this speech, which was conceived or drafted by Gorbachev as with the intention to be heard in the West, above all, as a kind of the anti-Fulton speech of Winston Churchill of 1946, which was announcing the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Iron Curtain over Europe. Well, except that the message that he was announcing in the United Nations was heard above all, and before maybe it was truly understood in the West, in the East, first in the countries of the Warsaw Pact, which very seriously and very quickly tried to profit and to make use of this freedom of choice the next year, the year of 1989. But immediately after that, with the nationalist movement in the former Soviet republics, they wanted to put Gorbachev to a test of his promise not to use force to suppress them and to keep them inside the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so the genie was out of the bottle, and it's interesting what you mentioned about the way messages are sent and how they are received. What's certainly been making the rounds on social media since news broke of Gorbachev's passing on late Tuesday is a 1997 TV commercial for U.S. fast food chain Pizza Hut.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев?
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Pizza Hut.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Now, that TV ad Andrei Grechev intended for audiences in 1997, not in 2022. When we look at it with hindsight, it can make people feel a little bit uncomfortable watching that, though.
Well, especially in the year when not only Pizza Hut but McDonald's, is leaving Moscow and the biggest cities in Russia, because we are observing the landscape of the present Russia, which is very different from what had been the vision and the hope of Gorbachev. But at the same time, you cannot neglect the fact that Gorbachev's perestroika, which actually took the image of the revolution of hopes at the beginning, especially of the political hopes, actually, suffered a kind of a shipwreck at the time when it had to confront a much harder agenda, that of the economic reform. And it was the form that this new economy took place already after Gorbachev, in the time of Yeltsin's years, that has brought the chaotic development, which probably is at the origin of the appearance of a certain Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the 1990s, the era of cowboy capitalism in Russia, oligarchs amassing vast wealth, high criminality. And when they look back upon that period, many Russians are a little bit traumatized. Vladimir Putin himself talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. There were no breaks in regularly scheduled programming Tuesday evening in Moscow. There was a message of condolence from the current occupant of the Kremlin and tributes to Gorbachev that are, measured.
He sincerely wanted to believe that the Cold War would end and that an eternal romantic period between the new Soviet Union and the collective West, as we call it, would come. That romanticism was not justified. There was no romantic period or honey-sweet century. The bloodthirstiness of our opponents showed itself.
Кровожадность наших оппонентов проявила себя.
Jean de Glignasti, you listen to the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov there, and you get the sense that it's as if the Iron Curtain never came down.
Yes, the underlying fact behind Peskov's words is that Gorbachev had been cheated by the West. and he thought he sort of bring an end to the Cold War, but Russia did that, but the West didn't do that. And by the way, Gorbachev himself had this kind of resentment at the end of his life. And in fact, his main achievement was the end of the Cold War, but for most of Russians, this has been made to the expense of Russia.
So he shared in that feeling that there somehow was a betrayal by the West.
Yes.
And do you think that's the case?
Well, what's important is the feeling of the Russian people. And I think the vast majority of the Russians think so.
So what could have been done differently?
Well, in the Russian minds, it's a non-extension of NATO, mainly, and most probably some kind of neutrality of Ukraine, but non-extension of NATO is the main thing. I think NATO is the symbol of Gorbachev being cheated.
Anastasia Shapachkina?
I would allow myself not to disagree. When we think about why the Iron Curtain has never come down, so to say, as we can see now, right, when we think about the war in Ukraine, Russian invasion, everything that we're seeing, and the powerful fist of the Russian propaganda at home, I would not say that is because Russia or Gorbachev or anyone else got cheated by the West. Because how can we say they got cheated by the West when first they never themselves have been ready to enter NATO just as a normal member? These discussions have been led numerous times under Yeltsin, under Putin. Russia has never seen itself just as Estonia of NATO, as another member. Now, how could it have been cheated by the West after having received billions and billions of aid from the Paris Club, the London Club, not to mention which they have only been able to pay between 2004 and 2006. So much money it was, and so long it took them to pay it off, not to mention the World Bank and the IMF. How has Russia been cheated by the West when G7 became G8? When Russia was accepted to every single one of the Western institutions, including WTO, when Russia has inherited and became the state heir of the Soviet Union in the UN Security Council, it didn't have to. It was an automatic process. It was decided by the members of the UN and especially by the West. Now, for me, the reason why the Iron Curtain has come up again or has never come down, which is pretty much, I agree, is definitely a better formulation, is not because the vast majority of the Russians think that they got cheated, because I don't think that the vast majority of anybody at all actually thinks. Individuals think. I think, you think. A vast majority doesn't think. And the vast majority of the Russians in the 90s, when the Russia was on its knees, according to Putin and his propagandists, vast majority was just busy with one single thing. And
you'll agree that it was a period of humiliation.
There was a period of huge economic struggle, not just for Russia, but for all 15 former Soviet republics, which became independent countries. I lived in Ukraine at that time, and I experienced exactly the same economic struggles, and as many of my Russian friends who lived in Russia, across different cities and different areas. But none of us was thinking about NATO back then. We were becoming teenagers, our parents were adults. Believe me, NATO was not on top of everybody's agenda. What was on top of everybody's agenda is who to borrow the money from so we can get by the end of the month. And how do we manage to get to the vegetable garden before dark, because that's where we grow our food in order to last through the winter. Believe me, the vast majority of the people was busy with that. The vast majority throughout the 90s was not busy at all with geopolitics, which the vast majority never has any hand on, especially in that type of political environment as Russia. And what I think is responsible for this rise of the Iron Curtain, or the fact that it's never come down, is better expressed by a Russian author who authored a book which is called To Kill the Dragon. And it's about a totalitarian state, which has a new ruler who kills the dragon, the old totalitarian ruler, just to find himself venerated by everyone else and just to find himself being pushed to become a new totalitarian ruler. And he comes to the conclusion that when he sees they don't want freedom, that the dragon is inside.
Andrei Grechev, is that a fair parable for Mikhail Gorbachev and the choices he faced?
Well, you cannot claim or pretend that Gorbachev, having announced his intention and having succeeded to fight the communist dragon, has become a dragon to replace him. That is certainly not true. And the proof, actually, the paradox of the situation is in his own fate. He has become the first Russian leader to be elected, and also the first, I would say rather Soviet, and the first Soviet leader to accept to quit his position because, as he was saying himself, the political institutions has ratified the creation of a new structure in which he had to step down without resorting to force to stick to power. So from this point of view, well, dragons' seeds are disseminated across the world. In this sense, Russia is not the particular place where these seeds produce dragons in any time, in any epoch, and in any generation. And if we go to the, embarrassing question of the NATO extension to the east, well, certainly Russia was not invited to join the NATO. Putin was saying that he once tried to speak about the question with Bill Clinton, but certainly his timid approach was ignored because naturally NATO was not interested to integrate such a huge member or a kind of a Russian bear that might crush the structure of NATO. But then, what would be the reason for NATO extension to the east at the time when the very reason of the initial creation of NATO in 1949, that was to fight the Soviet threat of extension or expansion to the east, has disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even earlier with Gorbachev, who was suggesting the construction, the building of the collective security system, integrating Russia in and replacing the bloc system that was existing before. And Gorbachev has produced the proof of his seriousness by dissolving unilaterally the Warsaw Pact.
Andrei Grechev, the last time we spoke, it was, again, the build-up to the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union. It was last December. At that point, there was a troop build-up, but there was no Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is now. Has that in any way, do you think, changed what his legacy is with the latest events, the decision by Vladimir Putin to invade?
Yeah, absolutely, because certainly, that would be, to say, a trivial thing, that had Gorbachev stayed at the top of the Soviet Union or of Russia, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, would have never lived up to the time and to the horror of the Russian invasion against Ukraine. That's obvious. And it would be enough to read the statements of Gorbachev and, for example, the record of his conversation with George Bush father, when he was warning the American president about the danger of the exploding of a number of various interethnic, international, interreligious conflicts across this huge territory of the Soviet Union, which might become a kind of the image of the new Yugoslavia. So naturally, what's going on, what's happening in the in relations between Russia and Ukraine is certainly a personal, not only a political drama, was for Gorbachev. If you don't forget that he himself was half Russian, half Ukrainian, his mother being Ukrainian, his wife Raisa was Ukrainian. So naturally, that is, well, maybe from Gorbachev's point of view, well, I would say me as an observer or just a commentator of his life and of his psychological state, I'm tempted even to interpret his passing as his way to demonstrate his reaction to what is going on in the country that he had once so loved.
And Jean de Gliniasti, you heard there Andrei Grechev drawing the parallel with Yugoslavia. Of course, the difference being Yugoslavia didn't have nuclear weapons.
Yes, it's true that the collapse of an empire is always bloody. And we thought at one moment that the collapse of USSR could be more peaceful, but it's not the case. It's true also that the difference with Yugoslavia is that Russia has atomic teeth, but it doesn't change the fact that we are in a sort of decolonization process, which is inevitable. And my feeling is that we handled it badly. It could have been better. And I think...
Who's we?
We, I mean, everybody. I mean, the Russians didn't accept, they didn't accept the Ukrainian as a people. And the Europeans didn't accept the West didn't accept the necessity to keep some kind of bridge between Ukraine and Russia. So there is a denial of the existence of a nation from the Russian part, and there's a denial from the West of some kind of Russian strategical preoccupation.
Anastasia Shapachkina?
Just on the question of Ukraine, I would like to note that Gorbachev has never really said anything about the Russian incursion in the east of Ukraine since 2014. He has not expressed himself clearly and against the
maybe not
Russian
publicly,
invasion.
but there are statements saying that he was against the invasion for the annexation of Crimea back in 2014.
He was for the annexation of the Crimea,
but against the latest invasion.
And he wasn't against the incursion into the east of Ukraine, into the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which preceded the invasion starting in February. And he never expressed his public, personal outrage. Instead, he supported the annexation of Crimea, which leaves us also kind of disappointed because he was not really in a position to fear anything for his personal position if he was so much against it and if he had such strong links. I want to underline that there are many people in Russia who have Ukrainian relatives who are Ukrainian, in fact, who were born and raised in Ukraine and who became Russian nationals with time and who support Vladimir Putin and his invasion today. And I don't say this was Gorbachev's position, but I just say that for many Russians who today have left Russia, and for the intellectuals, for the journalists, for the analysts, it is disappointing that he hadn't expressed openly and publicly his opposition, especially to the invasion or to the incursion into the eastern Ukraine preceding it.
Andrei Grechev, there's been a lot of ink spilled in the last 24 hours over the relationship between Mikhail Gorbachev and Vladimir Putin. What's your take on it?
Well, at this stage, I wouldn't like to speculate on that. Certainly, at the time when Gorbachev was president, well, he was ignorant of the existence of a certain officer of the Soviet secret services somewhere. Let's say in the structures of the KGB. Well, as to Vladimir Putin's attitude towards Gorbachev, I would say that from my point of view, he's in a rather embarrassing situation. First, let's not forget, he owes everything to Gorbachev. Hadn't Gorbachev realized this fantastic transformation of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet society, Vladimir Putin would have never been the president of the state. In the best perspective, he could have reached maybe a higher position inside his original structure. So, well, from this point of view, not only Putin, but the whole of the political elite, so to say, around him, owes a lot to this new image that Russia has taken, thanks to Gorbachev and to Perestroika. At the same time, the other aspect of that explains the embarrassing, I would say, attitude of Putin towards Gorbachev might be similar to that of the Chinese, who reproach Gorbachev for being, let's say, too ignorant, too negligent, or maybe careless about the efficient ways to keep the state structure together.
It was with an eye towards what was going on inside the Soviet Union that the Tiananmen crackdown was so hard back in 1989 in China.
Yeah, and certainly they have learned a lot from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and they wouldn't like to repeat it. They are not using Putin's term about the catastrophe of the breakup of the Soviet Union. But Putin's idea is that Gorbachev is certainly responsible first for, let's say, accepting the disappearance of this second in world superpower, and especially for the fact that his Russia of today is no more the power that is sharing with the West, and especially with the United States, the running of the world. Maybe, again, this is going to be the speculation. His dream would be to stage a kind of the Yalta II summit with him certainly taking the place of Stalin, and maybe with President Biden, who is more or less in the similar position as Franklin Roosevelt was in 1945, and maybe with the Chinese leader replacing Europe, which Vladimir Putin certainly despises.
Interesting to see if that ever comes off. Let's finish with one of the most heartfelt tributes. It comes from fellow Russian Nobel Peace Laureate to the editor-in-chief of the paper that Gorbachev funded at its outset, Dmitry Muratov, saluting the former Soviet leader's pursuit of peace and devotion to his late wife, Raisa. Let's remember forever, he loved a woman more than his work, put human rights above the state, and valued a peaceful sky more than personal power. I heard that he managed to change the world but failed to change his country. Maybe so, but he gave both the country and the world an incredible gift. He gave us 30 years of peace without the threats of global and nuclear war. Who else is capable of this? We'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Andrei Grechev, for joining us from Évreux, Jean de Glignesti as well, Anastasia Shapochkina. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.